The first winter after my husband died, I burned through 3 cords of wood before January. By February, I was cutting frozen branches just to keep the fire alive through the night. By March, I stopped sleeping properly. Not because I didn't have a bed, but because every time the fire died down, the cold crept in like something alive. It came through the walls, through the gaps, through the floorboards, through everything. And it didn't matter how much wood I burned. The cold always found a way in. My name is Margaret Hale. I was 46 years old when I realized something most people in Cedar Hollow never questioned. Cabins weren't failing because they were weak. They were failing because they were built wrong. My husband had built ours himself. Thick timber, tight joints, a solid roof. By all standards, it was a good cabin. But good wasn't enough anymore. Not with winters like the ones we were getting. Longer, colder, harsher than anything we had seen before. The kind that didn't just test your preparation. They punished your mistakes. And the biggest mistake we had all made was thinking one wall was enough. The realization didn't come from books or advice. It came from something simpler. Observation. I noticed it one afternoon in early spring. The snow had begun to melt, but only in certain places. Near the cabin walls, the snow stayed longer. But along one side, where a stack of old boards leaned against the exterior, the snow had melted faster. Not because of sunlight, but because of trapped warmth. I stood there for a long time, staring at that narrow space between the boards and the cabin wall. The air inside it felt different. Still, slightly warmer. Protected. And that was when the idea formed. What if the heat isn't escaping because the walls are weak? What if it's escaping because it has somewhere to go? That space, between the boards and the wall, it was holding heat, not letting it escape, not letting the wind reach it. It wasn't about making the cabin stronger. It was about trapping what was already there. I didn't act on it immediately, because winter had already taken too much out of me. Instead, I waited. Through spring, through summer, through the long, dry days when the cold felt like a distant memory. But I didn't forget, because I knew something others didn't want to admit. Winter would come back, and when it did, it would be just as bad, if not worse. So I prepared, not the way everyone else did, not by cutting more wood, not by reinforcing the same walls, but by planning something different, something no one else in Cedar Hollow was doing. I started gathering materials, scrap wood, old planks, anything that could stand upright, anything that could create space. People noticed, of course. They always did. "What are you building, Margaret?" one of the men asked when he saw the stack growing beside my cabin. "Nothing yet," I said. He frowned. "You're going to need more firewood than that." "I won't," I replied. He laughed. "Everyone needs more firewood." I didn't argue, because explaining it wouldn't have mattered. Not yet. By late autumn, everything was ready. The wood, the tools, the plan. All I needed was one thing: a warm day. Because once winter settled in, this wouldn't be possible. The ground would freeze. The air would bite too hard. The work would slow to nothing. But if I could get it done before that, if I could build it in time, then everything would change. The opportunity came in early November. A Chinook wind rolled through the valley. Warm, dry, melting the first layer of snow almost overnight. People stepped outside in confusion, coats loosened, breath no longer visible in the air. "It won't last," someone said. They were right. But I didn't need it to last. I just needed it long enough. That morning, I stepped outside and looked at my cabin. At the walls. At the structure that had failed me the winter before. And I knew exactly what needed to be done. I started at the north side. The side that took the worst of the wind. The coldest. The most unforgiving. I drove stakes into the ground a foot away from the cabin wall. Then another. And another. Creating a frame. Not touching the cabin. Not attached to it. Separate. Then I began attaching the planks. One by one. Building a second wall. Not thick. Not solid. But complete. A full barrier running parallel to the original structure. By midday, my hands were raw. My arms ached. But I didn't stop. Because I could feel the air changing already. The space between the walls was doing something. The wind hit the outer wall first. Slowed. Lost strength. And the air between stayed still. By late afternoon, the first side was complete. I stepped back and looked at it. It didn't look like much. Just another layer of wood. But I knew better. Because it wasn't the wood that mattered. It was the space. The invisible barrier it created. I moved to the next side. Working faster now. More certain. Because I could feel it working. By the time the sun began to set, 3 sides were finished. The Chinook wind was already fading, the temperature dropping again. But I didn't stop. I lit a lantern and kept going. Because this was the moment. The only moment. If I didn't finish now, I wouldn't get another chance. The fourth wall went up in near darkness. My hands numb. My breath returning in visible clouds. The warmth from earlier already gone. But I kept going. Board by board. Nail by nail. Until finally, it was done. I stepped back, exhausted, and looked at the cabin. It looked strange now. Larger. Boxed in. But still simple. Still unremarkable. No one passing by would think much of it. But I knew what I had built. Not just a second wall. A system. A barrier the wind couldn't cross. A space the cold couldn't penetrate the same way. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. The Chinook was gone. Winter had returned. And I lit the fire. Sat back. And waited. The difference came slowly. Subtly. At first, I thought I imagined it. But as the hours passed, it became undeniable. The fire didn't struggle. The heat didn't disappear. The walls didn't feel cold. I walked to the edge of the cabin and placed my hand against the interior wall. It was warm. Not just near the fire. Everywhere. Because the cold wasn't reaching it. Not the way it had before. The space between the walls was holding the heat. Trapping it. Keeping it where it belonged. I slept that night. Really slept. For the first time in months. And when I woke, the fire was still alive. The cabin still warm. And the woodpile untouched. By the end of the first week, I knew. This wasn't a small improvement. This was a complete change. I was burning half the wood. Sometimes less. The cold didn't creep in. Didn't steal the warmth when the fire dropped. Didn't wake me in the middle of the night. And outside, the valley was already beginning to struggle again. The first real storm hit in late November. Snow piled high. Wind howled through the valley. Cabins creaked. Fires burned constantly just to keep people alive. But inside mine, it was quiet. Steady. Unaffected. And that was when I understood something even more important. This wasn't just about me. Because if winter continued the way it had been, the way it was starting again, then sooner or later, the others would notice. Not the wall, not the wood, but the difference. And when they did, they would come looking for the reason why. Because the woman who should have struggled the most was the only one who didn't. And that was something the valley couldn't ignore forever. The second storm was worse than the first. It came without warning. No slow build. No gentle snowfall. Just wind. Relentless, screaming wind that tore across Cedar Hollow like it had something to prove. By nightfall, the valley had disappeared. Snow didn't fall. It moved sideways, driven by gusts strong enough to bend trees and rattle shutters loose from their hinges. I sat inside my cabin, watching the flame in the stove. Steady. Unbothered. That was the first sign something had truly changed. Last winter, a storm like this would have turned the fire into a fight. Drafts would sneak through cracks, pulling heat away, forcing the flame to work harder just to stay alive. But now, the air inside didn't move. Not the way it used to. The second wall was doing exactly what I had hoped. The wind hit the outer layer first, spun itself there, and whatever cold remained got trapped in the space between. By the time it reached the inner wall, it had nothing left. I stood slowly and walked toward the far side of the cabin, the side that used to feel like ice during storms. I placed my hand against the wood. Warm. Not just near the stove. Not just in patches. Everywhere. The warmth wasn't escaping anymore. It was staying. Circulating. Holding. I let out a slow breath. Because this wasn't just improvement. This was control. Outside, the storm grew louder. The kind of sound that used to make me brace myself. Prepare for a long night. A cold one. But not this time. I sat back down, fed a single log into the fire, and waited. Hours passed. The storm didn't ease. If anything, it grew stronger. And yet, inside, nothing changed. The temperature held. The air stayed still. The fire burned low, but never struggled. I didn't add another log until morning. And even then, it wasn't because I had to. It was because I chose to. That was when I understood the full weight of what I had done. I wasn't surviving winter anymore. I had stepped outside of it. 3 days later, the storm finally broke. The valley emerged slowly from beneath the snow. Buried. Altered. Struggling. I stepped outside for the first time since it began. The cold hit me immediately. Sharp. Biting. Unforgiving. It reminded me of what the world still was. And what I had managed to keep out. The path to town was nearly gone. Snow had piled high enough to reshape the land itself. It took me over an hour to reach the main road. And when I did, I saw it. The difference. Cabins sagging under the weight of snow. Smoke rising thin and uneven from chimneys. People moving slower than usual. Careful. Tired. Cold. Jacob Turner was the first to notice me. He stood near the general store, bundled in layers, his beard crusted with frost. "You made it through," he said. I nodded. "So did you." He gave a short laugh. "Barely." His eyes studied me for a moment, then narrowed slightly. "You don't look like someone who just went through that storm." I didn't respond, because there was no easy way to explain it. He glanced past me, toward the direction of my cabin. "How much wood did you burn?" "Not much." He frowned. "That's not possible." "It is." Turner shook his head. "I went through half my stack in 3 days." I didn't. Now his curiosity had shifted into something sharper. Suspicion. Interest. "Margaret," he said slowly. "What did you change?" I held his gaze, then said simply, "I stopped letting the heat escape." He frowned again. "That doesn't mean anything." "It does," I said. "You just haven't seen it yet." Word spread quickly after that. It always did in Cedar Hollow. By the end of the week, people were noticing. Not because I told them, but because they were looking for differences, looking for answers. And eventually, they found one. The second wall. At first, they didn't understand it. It looked simple. Too simple. Just an extra layer of wood around the cabin. "What's the point of that?" one man asked. "It doesn't even touch the house." "That's the point," I said. He frowned. "What does that even do?" I stepped closer and pointed to the space between the walls. "That space is what matters." He looked at it, then back at me. "It's just air." "Yes. And air doesn't stop the cold." "No," I said. "But it stops movement." That was when Turner stepped forward. "The wind hits the outer wall first," he said slowly, piecing it together. "Yes. And whatever cold gets through, it has nowhere to go." I finished. He nodded. "It just sits there and loses strength." The man who had asked the question looked between us. "That's it," he said. "That's all it takes." I shrugged slightly. That's all it took. Silence followed, because they were all thinking the same thing. Something so simple. Shouldn't have made such a difference. But it had. The next storm came a week later. Not as violent, but cold enough to remind everyone that winter wasn't done yet. That was when the real change began. One by one, people started building. Not new cabins. Not stronger walls. But second ones. They used whatever they had. Old planks. Scrap wood. Even stacked brush in some cases. Anything that could create that space. That barrier. At first, the results were uneven. Some built too close. Others left gaps. But slowly, they learned. Adjusted. Improved. And with each storm, the difference became clearer. Fires lasted longer. Wood piles shrank slower. Homes stayed warmer. Not perfectly, but better. And better was enough. By the end of winter, Cedar Hollow looked different. Not just because of the snow, but because of how people had adapted. Cabins no longer stood alone. They were layered. Protected. Changed. Turner stood beside me one afternoon as the snow began to melt. "You know what the funny part is?" he said. "What?" "We've been fighting winter the same way for years." I nodded. "Trying to outbuild it. Outburn it. Outlast it." He looked toward the cabins. Now wrapped in second walls. Different. Smarter. And all it took. He gestured toward my home. Was a gap. I smiled slightly. "Not a gap. A barrier." He nodded. "Same thing." "No," I said. "A gap lets things through. A barrier stops them." He considered that for a moment, then laughed quietly. "Fair enough." We stood there in silence for a while, watching the valley slowly come back to life. Snow melting. Smoke rising stronger from chimneys. People moving with more energy than before. Because something had changed. Not just in the structures, but in the thinking. They had stopped trying to fight winter directly, and started working around it. Turner glanced at me. "You built that in one day." "Yes. And it changed everything." I shook my head slightly.